Welcome to this episode of The Meaning Mindset with Rabbi Ron. I'm delighted to be your host, and I'm thrilled to share the wisdom, the insights of two professors from Yale University, two of three who run the course called Life Worth Living. At Yale, it's the most in-demand course in the humanities department at that university, and they are the authors of Life Worth Living, a guide to what matters most, along with Miroslav Volf. Our guests today are Matthew Croasmun and Ryan McAnnally-Linz. What this book offers is ancient and modern wisdom, insights from people living life today as you and I are, struggling through life as you and I inevitably are, along with some of the great thinkers of the past in answering the question or coming to the great questions of life, not necessarily giving us our own answer, because we're going to have to find that ourselves. We're going to each have to do the grappling toward the life worth living on our own. But the book does an extraordinary job of giving you wisdom, distilling wisdom to a place and a point where you can access it, grapple with it, think about it, and actually apply it to your life. One of the things that I loved about the book is the way that different schools of thought, whether they're religious or philosophical, ancient or modern, are brought together in one book based on one course that's being taught at university. And the course really informs the book, because not only do students' insights and experiences make it into the text of the book, but also you have the sense that this has been put through the crucible. This isn't just authors sitting and saying, what are the great ideas? But they've had to have them in conversation for year after year since 2013 with a group of presumably very bright thinkers, students at Yale University. So let's join our guests, Matt Croasmun and Ryan McAnnally-Linz. All right, I just want to welcome the both of you and thank you so much for joining me. Your book had an enormous impact on me. I listened to it. I thought, by the way, it was a fantastic narrator that you chose for it, or your editor or publisher chose. She did a great job. And I see that in Audible, I have just a slew of bookmarks and comments that I made to myself as I was listening to the book, when I was traveling, when I was home, at the gym, wherever it was. I didn't want to miss points. I kept going back and back. And before this interview, of course, before this episode, I went back to my notes. I thought, okay, there are too many. And I'm listening to these little memos going, what was the context of that? And then I made the decision to buy the hardcover, so I'd actually own the book, and so that I could actually look at it, because that other aspect of my brain isn't engaged that way. So I want to ask you about how this course that led to this book, how did the course come to Yale University Humanities Department? How did it grow to be the most in-demand course in the department? And how did that, along with your colleague, motivate the three of you to turn it into a book? And by the way, it reads as something that's been carefully thought through and studied. And I think maybe that makes it particularly unique as a book, because I get the sense that you've really tested and pulled on all of these ideas and pressed on them and heard conversations and read papers and heard people's reflections and responses to these ideas. So it's a unique book in terms of that kind of richness and the sense that it went through a crucible before it made it to print. So how did you get to this point from not having that course to originating it and then ultimately to the book?
Thank you so much for your kind words. We got started in 2013. Our co-author, Miroslav Volf, was observing the contemporary landscape in higher education as he saw it, and noting a kind of a need, which is another word for an opportunity, for bringing deep reflection on the shape of flourishing life, on the really existential stuff that matters to our lives into the classroom. There's room for that in the dorm room hallways at 2 a.m., right? But most university classes are focused on other things, and it's all well and good that lots of a university life be focused on organic chemistry and the history of the English novel and all of those sort of things. But something crucial he thought was missing if there isn't also a place to, this is Matt's phrase, kind of give students an opportunity to marry the best of their intellectual energies with their deepest existential questions. And so that was the spark, right? That was the point where there was a kind of vision for this class. I was a doctoral student at the time, and I heard my advisor musing about this class he was thinking of teaching. And I shoved my foot in the door and wouldn't take it out until he let me in to the room. And we designed a class together and taught it for the first time in 2014 to a group of 14 Yale College students. And it was an experiment. We had a vision for this kind of education with these kind of questions, kind of personal, first person. Students' lives are kind of at the table, not just their minds. But we hadn't really done it before ourselves. So we did the experiment and it kind of worked. Matt, I'll let you take the story from there.
No, sure. Yeah, so I had the opportunity to sit on the very last class of that first year, and the question on the table was a sort of meta level question. Hey, how did this go? Should we do this again? What should we change? What should we definitely not change? And students were over the moon about it. They were, it was a unique opportunity that they had really been looking for, and a unique sort of space. And they were saying, "Oh, this should be a required class for every student. It should be a year long. We should, they were very enthusiastic." So, like Ryan, I also shoved my foot in the door and said, "I want to be a part of this going forward." And I think. As it grew, humanities courses at universities only ever grow so large. But it was when you have more than 100 students in the room, we started to think, well, we really would love to share this with other kinds of audiences. As we took it places, people were eager to say. Teachers would say to me, who are primary, secondary school teachers saying, "Oh, you're waiting way too late if you're waiting till college to ask these questions. We've got to ask them with high school students." Sure. No, high school's way too late. You got to ask them with middle school students, right? It gets younger and younger. Folks who are in the middle of their career saying, "Oh man, I wish I would have wasted my time if I was asking these questions when I was a college student," or maybe the more positive version. "I would love to ask these questions knowing now what I know that I didn't know when I was a college student. I would have asked them one way then. I'd love to ask them now." Folks who are facing retirement, thinking, "Oh boy, maybe actually it's interesting." Folks looking at retirement and seniors in college actually have a lot in common. Sort of the big life transitions, sure. Kind of wondering, raise these questions of what really matters most. We had an opportunity to take up these conversations with folks who were incarcerated, and that situation it gives its own sort of cast. So all to say is we brought these sorts of conversations. They were always just that, and that's really been at the core of the class right from the beginning, was conversation. We thought, boy, we'd love to bring this to a broader audience. And for a few years, as you picked up on, these questions spent a lot of time sort of percolating and being refined, and then a couple of years to sort of figure out how could we take live conversations that were never the same as they happened around a seminar table or in a gathering room in a prison or at a community center, wherever we were having these conversations. How do we take that to a book? You have the fruits of that reflection. And we really hope that it all comes back full circle, and what it really does is generate more conversations as people take this book up together, maybe with their neighbors, their friends, their colleagues, folks that are part of a religious community with them. That's the goal. And we're glad to have another conversation with you today.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really enjoying it already. I'm supposing that I know more than many people in the audience because they're left with a title at this point and your introduction. They haven't yet delved into the book. Before we go into some of the meat of the book, and there's so much in it, one observation that I have is I thought one of the things you did seamlessly, really beautifully, was marry ancient wisdom with modern reflection. And you'd bring in the student struggles and then to go to Seneca or to, any of these thought leaders, and then go back to how people are actually dealing with them, as you say, in incarceration as well. One thing that always makes me wonder, And as a rabbi, clearly I'm somebody like you as a teacher or as an author that hopes that the words I send out, the lessons I send out, will land and make some change in at least one person's life. And I know that's either great ego or just a grand hope. But what's your sense of the audience is interested in this and how you widen the audience to people who aren't ordinarily in the category of what maybe you and I would call seekers, people who are invested in growing in a way that you and I might assume all people are? I think there's a certain presumably large group of people who are going to that bookcase at the bookstore and many people who are going left and right of it. What do you think that audience is, and how does a book like this grow that audience to improve society, frankly?
That's a great question.
Thank you.
I know we're supposed to, as authors, think a lot about audience. I have the bad habit of really just thinking about the ideas that I want to get out there and hoping that the audience will come and meet them.
Right.
As Matt's overview of the kinds of folks who've gotten in touch with us suggests, there are folks from a lot of different walks of life, a lot of different stages of life, who have come to engage with these kind of questions, and our book in particular. And the reason I think it's hard to give a kind of a demographic or like a psychographic account of who these folks are is because I'm convinced that the vast majority of human beings have some version of these questions. It's kind of simmering in their souls as they live their life. And it, most folks don't spend their time giving kind of specific, definite, or abstract articulation to the questions and the various answers to it. But what these questions, this kind of reflection is supposed to be, is a kind of drawing out of the cares and concerns that are present in our lives, that are part of being a human being. And so almost everybody is potentially part of the audience. And there's a kind of work. So a couple of days ago, the great Latin American liberation theologian Gustavo Gutierrez passed away. And the liberation theologians have this concept. In Spanish, they call it concientización, like conscientization, where part of the process of kind of working with the communities that they worked with was setting up contexts in which the members of those communities could come to see problems as problems, could come to recognize kind of what was going on that was the source of various forms of dissatisfaction. And I take it the one thing we're trying to do in our book and any sort of, and the kind of ministry that you're doing here is to present people with an opportunity to get a like slightly better grip on what that little twinge in your heart is, what's behind the feeling of that dilemma or being stuck in this kind of way, and the hope is that we can give an opportunity to like step back, see it a little more clearly, and then re-engage your life in a richer way.
Matt, I just want to pick up on something you said before. You talked about the people at different stages in life who are saying, wait a second, you're wasting this on me. Why didn't you give it to me when I was that age? And I think I sit with people of all ages, right? I sit in my study, in my office. I'm with a 13-year-old preparing for bar mitzvah. This is the book for them if there was a version of it. And I hope that in some narrow way, I'm trying to give them my version of the same kind of conversation. One of the things that strikes me is that in our society, and I don't want to critique the society, I just want to say there is a reality that we're guiding ourselves toward perhaps less or more worthy goals. A lot of us are raising our kids for good grades. to get into the right university. You happen to be teaching at one. And to get the next great goal, which is success in their professional life, which leads to presumably another great goal, which is a kind of wealth and satisfaction and ultimately a good life. Something you talk a lot about in the book. How do you bring that back to the parents sitting at the table? How do we make that practical, a conversation that parents can have with young kids to say, yes, your grades in math and science are important and interesting, but there's another part of your character that's even more important to us as your parents?
That's a great, so this is one of my great hopes actually with the book is that that it can become an intergenerational touch point. And I think that's what wisdom traditions at their best are. Right. They're all sort of intergenerational opportunities. In fact, one of my favorite moments, one of the best outcomes for me in teaching this course over the last 10 years was when I had a student write her final paper for me on it was a meditation on a comment that her grandmother had made at the Passover table, at the Seder table. The grandmother said to her, she said, when I see you and your cousins sitting at the table arguing with each other, I think to myself, I've done my job. Right. I've done right. My job here is done. And this student, this is a good, insightful sort of comment. And this student really ran with it and said, "This is what the good life is for her." She said, "The good life is coming to the table, being part of a conversation, being part of a tradition, an ongoing dialogue across the generations, but arguing, right?
Right.
Not just receiving it passively. This is a very Jewish, of course, conception, I think, right? And it's sort of a thought that so you want to be in the conversation, but you want to be arguing. You want to be having your own say. Anyway, it was a beautiful, beautiful paper. And she sent a draft of this back to her grandmother, who sent it to the student's mother, the grandmother's daughter, and then all three of them ended up having this, 3-generation, conversation about the nature of the good life, what it means to live in and through tradition and find meaning, especially as we don't just passively receive a wisdom tradition, but really get inside of it and wrestle with it. She, with their permission, then forwarded me. I had this whole email correspondence sent to me, and I thought, this is the best possible outcome right. Of this course. And so, maybe not to have such grandiose hopes for the book, but that's, I think, one of my great hopes for the book is we do feel like we're having a conversation, in the college with just one generation. And the hope is that they can have this conversation. But what's needed often is shared vocabulary. And again, this is what these traditions historically have offered us for those who are building lives outside of these traditions. Often there isn't that shared vocabulary to be able to say, how do I distinguish? I mean, it's even hard to articulate in our contemporary environment the distinction, what we try to get at in the book, between what we want and what we believe is worth wanting. I mean, even just that way of phrasing it, right, is like you can see us even struggling with contemporary language to find some way of like making what I think to most ancients was like a totally obvious distinction. And I think in most wisdom traditions, it's pretty easy to sort of get to get language like this, but it's difficult in our modern Western world to, for example, draw any sort of distinction between our desires and what's actually worthy. But as we hope that the book and these kinds of conversations, engagement with the wisdom traditions, these things equip us with the language to be able to have these conversations across generations. Because that's often, as you say, I mean, when our students articulate some of their own struggles with their own visions of life, they are, as they ought to be at 20, 21, 22 years old, they're struggling with voices from their family that they've internalized. I mean, we all know that, right? We've internalized parental voices. And now as a parent, I can see my teenager going through this, and I want to be hopefully that better parent who says to her, I care about more things in your grades in mathematics.
Especially mathematics.
Especially mathematics. Yeah. But there's a part of me that I'm not fully sort of converted, as it were, right? There's part of me that's caught up in things that I think aren't ultimately worthy of our shared humanity, but are part of my life story. And it's easy in a place like Yale to start to think that sort of this vision of achievement and success that you just laid out for us, and start to get back invested in those things. I'll just say that, I think this does have to be intergenerational conversation, because the norms that we're trying to think critically about are passed along intergenerationally, whether we do that intentionally, unintentionally, implicitly, explicitly, right? We may have never had a conversation about it, but we all got from the sideways glances or whatever it was, or from, the kinds of the things that our parents maybe said about other students at our school or other members of the family or whatever it is. We've read between the lines to figure out sort of what counted as a good life.
Sure.
In our home of origin. If we're going to take up a question of trying to ask, well, is that vision true? Is that the right one? Is that really what it means to live a life worthy of our humanity? It's almost, even when we're the only one in the room, it's already an intergenerational conversation.
Yeah, I wonder if we don't need to simplify, and I don't mean that to belittle anybody else, but I think I need it as well, which is give me a simple how-to, right? Give me a way to sit down and have a conversation with my kid at this age or that age that actually will reorient them from the math grades. Sorry to keep picking on math, but it's very personal for me, that failure. But to be able, I don't know the families necessarily have the language. They're not going to sit with their 12-year-old and quote Seneca. They're going to hopefully just sit and grapple with, how do I teach you that your baseball game matters and your church attendance matters and your grades in school maybe matter most? How do I, narrow it down to guiding you toward what I think will be perhaps, hopefully, an even better life, more worthy one than your parents or grandparents led? But do you agree with me that we kind of need somehow to, it's almost like we need to bring it down to, what are the cards called? The little kind of index cards, a way to have a conversation.
Well, I mean, there have been, I think Alain de Botton's group, at some point put together just like a deck of conversation cards you can put on the table at the,
Sure.
Well, if any of us still have family dinners together when we're
things
at the
you can
table,
text your kid from across the table.
Yeah, just text them. But I think that's also where doing some of the sort of simplification work for ourselves, right? If you can give a complex answer to a question, a little, right? If you can give a more simple version, a little bit more, right? And if you can give, an answer, as one of the rabbis said, while standing on one foot, then maybe you know a lot, right? And I love one of our colleagues who teaches in the high school environment. One of his assignments is he asks students to write. Their school has a 3-word slogan, and these 3 values. I don't know what it is, but they're over every door or whatever. And he asks these kids. He says, "What are the 3 words you want hung over your life? Right? What are the 3 words that you hope will sort of summarize your life and towards which you want your life oriented?" And week after week in his class, in addition to doing whatever reading they're doing, reading their Seneca, again, we keep coming back to math, we keep coming back to Seneca. In addition to reading all these folks, they're also hearing from adults, from grown-ups in the school who or in the community who are brought in, hauled in, ask some questions about their lives, but then have to give their 3 words. They get to explain those words as well, but they have to boil their life, sort of vision down to 3 words. And I love that practice, right? So for me, it's humility, courage, and integrity. And that's actually like doing that work. I mean, part of what we do even in the university, we give them more than 3 words, but we give them relatively short word limits for their papers, right? Because just as you're saying, the work here is paring down, getting it worked out. Now, I don't know that courage, humility, and integrity were going to work as conversation starters for my 8-year-old. So there may be yet another layer of simplification that goes on. But you're surely never not going to be able to reduce it and make it communicable to an 8-year-old if it takes you, a half an hour to narrate it to yourself. So we need to have some of these abilities to sort of figure out, okay, that matters, but what matters most? Those matter a lot, but what matters most, and how do we sort of find what's at the real sort of core for us?
I want to go to a point you make in the book, a provocation, which is to say that this book might wreck your life. I want to read it anyway on the basis of that sentence. And I think it should have the capacity to make us stop, change direction. I mean, I think that's what a great book does. I think this is a great book. What do you mean by that? What do the three of you mean by that when you provoked us with that statement?
Yeah, I personally have the sense that over my life, I've often built up structures of my life in the form of habits and investments of time and money and other such things that kind of embody some implicit vision of what really matters and why. And oftentimes, the vision that my life comes to embody is not one that I would endorse upon reflection. It's not a vision that I would aspire to. It's one that I've kind of stumbled into, just kind of skated into in a certain sort of way. And so in my life, the value of this kind of reflection is its ability to sometimes upend some of those structures, to give me the sort of impulse that I need to connect with the considered aspirations that I have, and to give some leverage to fight against the kind of inertia into other forms of life that are less worthy of seeking, less worthy of investing my existence in, and
no matter how tempting they are in the moment.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's not that I'm not at a kind of reflexive and even kind of certain conscious level engaged and interested in going after the things I'm going after in my life, but just that. But when I kind of excavate around the edges and find, there's actually no foundation there. Wouldn't it be worth building something that could last? And so the hope, there's a certain sense in which you've just got to wreck the stuff that's there to build the better thing. That's not the only way this reflection works. It's sometimes what happens is you go through the reflection and realize that your life has been smarter than your beliefs for a while, and then there's a renewed appreciation for the ways that that say a certain kind of small faithfulness to the daily life of one's household is not the kind of trivial thing that you've been thinking of it as. To say you've been chafing against doing the dishes and making lunch for kids in the morning and things like that, as you wishing you could get to more important things. This kind of reflection might come back and tell you, oh, no, you've been doing the important things.
Sure.
And that kind of transfigures then your life as it has been. So it's a possibility. It doesn't make as good a book chapter title, right? To say this book might transfigure aspects of your life that you didn't realize were really important.
Or rethink dishwashing, by the way. Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about two ways of upending your life that you really address in the book. One is consciously reading and thinking and reflecting. Something that I love in the book is that you take these big ideas, bring them down to size, and then leave us with ways of imagining them in our own lives, challenging our own thinking. In other words, the kind of what I think of as the distillation page at the end of each chapter. You're asking us, how do I apply these ideas? What are my thoughts in relation to my experiences? What did you call the names? I can't remember what you call that page.
Your turn.
There we go. Okay. All right. Your turn. The your turn part is a really important part of this interaction that the book offers. There's another upending, and one point that you make, if I'm remembering correctly, is that maybe there's value in being upendable. It's okay. I mean, I think we value stability so much, and we're trained in so many ways to value stability. And what you're saying is, what if we also value being upendable, flexible, able to fall? We have knees, so therefore get up again and maybe do better. What's your thought on that?
Yeah, I think that's, I think any book, if it has a chance to change a life at all, needs to be allowed to wreck it, right? And so that's that sort of, but that really depends on the reader, right? And taking that outside the context of books, that's what's true in life. If we're going to really learn from life, we need to be ready to be upended, and I think you're right about that. I mean, your comment on stability really rings differently, honestly, now than it did for us, I think, before the pandemic.
Right.
Because I think, we certainly see with our students these days, just in the last few years, a really different sort of posture of like what their sort of default interests and what their default aspirations are. Aspirations before the pandemic at Yale, aspiration was like world change, man. I'm gonna turn this world upside down, even if it's just by making an app that gets downloaded onto a billion phones and makes a very small impact in the lives of billions of people. But I'm going to change the world, right? It's actually it's the sort of slogan of the old HBO show Silicon Valley. We're going to change the world through all whatever it was. Whatever it was that you really wanted to do, you had to at least call it world change. Right. Now, after the pandemic, what students want most of all is stability. They want a reliable life. They want a life that's gonna carry them through inevitable moments where the world is going to do plenty to upend their lives on its own, right? So first of all, I just want to say, like, I want to have a certain amount of compassion for the sort of reasonableness of a certain kind of desire for stability, especially for our young people whose adolescence, whose childhoods were completely upended by things entirely outside of their or our control. But yeah, I think there's a sort of, but look, if we're looking to none of that changes the fact that if we're looking to grow as people, we need to have enough of our lives sort of on the table, as it were, that we can actually do that. We can actually change. We can pivot. We can turn. And I mean, a pivot is an interesting way of thinking about it, right? Like there may be like one foot that sort of stays in place, right? That sort of has there's some sort of core convictions that remain what they are, but the other, we need to be ready to move the other foot, right? And so yeah, that sort of it is interesting because rhetorically, I think I've really sort of changed a little bit of the modulation of that rhetoric of, oh, this class is going to wreck your life. It's going to turn everything up and down, right? I mean,
like a gym class.
It used to be like you said, students would be like, oh, well, that's it. If you're going to turn my life upside down, I'm all in. That's what I'm all, Now we get a little bit of look of oh, please don't turn my life upside down. I just started to get my bearings again. And so, but there, like I said, still is some version of that's saying, hey, I want to be open to the possibility I was wrong. Deeply, profoundly wrong. Maybe even my pivot foot was the one that had it wrong, and that is the one that I got to start moving. We need to be ready. For me, that connects to that sort of value of intellectual humility.
Definitely
to be wrong and being ready to revise.
I remember I was in basic training in the Air Force. It was very hot, Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio, Texas. And we knew, I don't know that I really knew much in advance of what I was expecting. I probably had a romantic idea of it from movies, but the idea was they were going to break us down to build us up again. And that kind of made me think about this idea of this book's going to wreck your life. We're going to bring you down to a state of, call it humanity, call it, well, hopefully, wreck the ego, shake the ego. break you down to a point where the Air Force, could build you up with that set of values. So not arguing for or against those values, they have obviously a purpose in that context.
Yeah,
I think it's useful. Often what I see when people have those train wreck moments in their lives that realign them to a different purpose, if they do, it's after a horrific diagnosis, or as you say, a pandemic, or any of these, call it minor or major, these cataclysmic moments that make us rethink, where are we? Who are we? What's our purpose? What I then see is often people forget that quickly. You know, they get the diagnosis, they come out of the hospital going, oh my God, the doctor saved my life, or he said, I have life ahead of me. And then they start complaining about the next temperature of the latte, right? So we go straight back to this kind of default response to life, which brings me to something that I want to look at for a moment. You talk about the distinction between what we want and what's worth wanting, which I think is a bumper sticker. It's a good slogan. It's a good reminder on the fridge to say, what do I want and what's worth wanting? Maybe that's part of what's in the fridge as well. But but I think we need that kind of regular questioning. And one thing you talk about, and I made a note of it because I want to quote it directly, is you talk about different ways, modes of moving through life. And one is autopilot. The other is effectiveness. The other is self-awareness. And the other is self-transcendence. I wonder if you could help us understand each of those and how they relate to each other.
Yeah, so autopilot is the kind of thing I was mentioning earlier, where most of us spend most of our life in this way, right? Most everything is fixed. A lot of it is habitual. We're just chugging along, and there's nothing inherently wrong with that. If we were living in kind of intense degrees of self-consciousness and reflection at all times, life would kind of stop, and the stuff that you might decide is good upon reflection wouldn't be possible. So there's nothing inherently wrong with autopilot, but autopilot can get you in a rut, and it can be leading you. It doesn't have built in any sort of ways of course correcting if the direction is off. It's not reflective. And so Matt is kind of the originator of this framework, said beyond autopilot, there are three kinds of questions that you could ask to get you to these deeper layers of reflection. You want to take it, Matt?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, so first is this effectiveness question, and this is the one that we're pretty used to. This is the how-to question. How do I get more of what I want? How do we get more of what we're after? And those are important questions to ask. As it turns out, I think as like moderns, of all the reflective questions, these are the ones we're best at. We're good at technology questions. We're good at how to, and we're especially good at asking these questions. It's sort of like, it's our reflex, ask a question. We're going to ask a how-to question.
Is that part of the part of our nature that is always problem solving?
Yeah, exactly. We can always do this a little bit faster, a little bit cheaper, a little bit more effectively. We can get better outcomes of the sorts that we're already after, right? But in that, we're not really asking much about the goals themselves, right? We're just iterating on goals wherever they came from. The self-awareness level is where we start to ask some questions about the goals, about the ends themselves. We say, well, hold on. I was just so busy, working on how to make more widgets. I never really stopped and considered, do I really want to make more widgets? Is more widgets what I want in life? And so, here we take a turn inward and we start to ask those questions of, what do I want? What do I really want? What do I really, really, really want? We go deeper and deeper into our sort of interior, and understanding our desires. And our desires are multi-layered. And our desires, especially these days when corporations are spending billions and billions of dollars to shape our desires are kind of messy, and we have to dig in there. And we generally, as moderns, we're inclined to think that we're looking for the oldest, the most authentic, the most interior, the most sort of original inclinations. We're trying to identify those, and we can iterate on just that. And honestly, most of what I think, as I see it, most of what sort of passes for personal reflection these days usually lives at these two layers of reflection. It's what do I want and how can I get it? And we can be more reflective
sorry to interrupt
about
you.
What do I want?
I'm locked on the idea that we need an example. Can you just help me? Just, I don't want to take a chance that it's not clear enough. Sorry to interrupt you.
Sure. Yeah, no. So I mean, for we can go back to that hopeful undergraduate, right? So when I was in high school, right, the dream was to get into an elite university, right? And so effectiveness questions are: what classes should I take? How should I write my essay? Who should I ask to write my recommendations? All of that stuff to get into the school of my dreams. You could swap in a professional aspiration. I want to get the job, or I want to get the promotion, right? The self-awareness question is to say, well, hold on for a second. Is getting into the best college really the thing that I care about most? Is this the thing that matters most to me? Is this really what I want? And honestly, if you're probably to ask me, and if I was able to be honest at like 16 or 17 years old, the answer was yes. That is what I very much, really, definitely, honestly wanted. Like, you could have taken me to the top of the mountain, and as long as the only thing you asked me to do at the top of that mountain was to examine my own preferences, my own desires, I had to come back down from the mountain and said, what I want is to go to an elite university, right? And that shows you some of the limitations, right, of that sort of exploration. This really is just explorations of our own desires. And again, I'm not putting that down. That has its own place, right? And that can really rescue you from, boy, I was working hard on a goal. I was working hard to get into this college, but I never even, because some kid, I don't know, you might tap some kid at some point and they'd say, hold on, no, that was mom and dad's dream. Sure. That wasn't my dream. I didn't want to go to the elite college. I'm going to go do something else, right?
Go play guitar.
Well, I was just going to
say,
I'm
going to go play guitar. I'm going to go join a rock band. Like, forget this, right? And that could be really important, right? For that person, that young person, to have that moment of realizing, oh, wait, this isn't even what I want. I want something else. But then there are the people, like, I think the like a less reflective younger me who maybe even have done some work figuring out what they want. They've got some pretty well-tuned strategies they're pretty effective at getting exactly what they want. So you can imagine, that young kid, that teenager gets into the school of their dreams, or maybe you get that promotion you were chasing after, you achieve that professional dream that you've been working after, and it really is your dream. And then after some time, I mean, for our undergrads, it often happens really quickly. They get to Yale. Being at Yale seemed like so special. And then they look around, and as far as they can tell, everyone else around them is also at Yale. It feels all of a sudden a whole lot less special.
Even that guy got it. Yeah.
Yeah, even that kid got in. Like, what the heck? Or whatever, right? You achieve that next professional run. I thought everything would change once I was a manager. I thought everything would change once I had my own company, once I was a senior vice president, whatever it was, right? Once I had a book on the New York Times bestseller, everything would change. Everything would change then, right? And then at some point you start to think like, well, somehow the satisfaction doesn't come, or there's something deeper that's sort of telling you, I got everything I wanted and I'm left wanting. What's that about then, right? And that's where we think this sort of question of self-transcendence comes in, right? But the question isn't what do I want? The question is what's actually worth wanting? Because the thing that I wanted maybe isn't satisfying not even just not satisfying to me, maybe it's, even if it did satisfy every desire I had, it actually, from some other point of view, maybe from the point of view of God, maybe from the point of view of the universe, maybe from the point of view of my tradition extending back through history for generations, and reaching into the future, whatever it might be, from some other point of view other than just me and my desires, maybe what the genuine desires of my heart even, maybe they're really not what it's all about. Maybe they're part of the picture, but they're not the whole picture. Maybe they're not even part of the picture, and I've really been off on the wrong track, right? I had that moment when I was an undergraduate where I realized at some point I had said I wanted that elite school because I wanted to be an elite, whatever that meant, human. I wanted to be the best. I wanted to be famous. Whatever it was, right? I wanted that success dream that you were describing. And again, it wasn't a matter of figuring out, I didn't really want that. I really, really, really wanted that, right? But at some point I had a group of people who loved me more than they were impressed by me, who were able to sort of shine an outside light on my life and suggest that I was actually building my life around some things that, for maybe from the most important perspective, were relatively petty. And we're able to sort of get that leverage, and everybody's got a different leverage point. For Plato, it's the realm of the forms. For theists, it's going to be God's perspective. For Confucius, it's going to be the sort of traditions of the ancestors. There are various different sort of leverage points, but all of these points, the reason we call it self-transcendence is they're all getting beyond just the self, giving you some sort of leverage at some point, even if you're just distinguishing. And I don't know, Ryan would disagree on this. There's a degree of this. It's like half self-transcendence if you get to the point where there's even some authentic version of myself that's not me as I am, but me as I ought to be, or something like that. Even that maybe is some way of is sort of like using the self to get leverage against the self, or an image of the self that gets leverage on the self. It's some way of getting past just me and my little desires. And that's really where we think the rubber hits the road. And we have opportunity to really start to get a broader image. And that's where we have to avail ourselves of the wisdom traditions to start to get some sense of what might be worth wanting, aside from whatever we happen to want.
Couple reflections on that. One is, you made me think about the book as a whole, and something. I have a library full of books, as I see you do behind you as well. I think Yale has a few more. But in my library, I tend to have them in categories, and I have my Jewish library, which is massive, as you'd expect. And then I have an Islamic library, and I have Christian thinkers, and I have humanistic thinkers, all these different categories on different shelves. And I tend to use one or the other, depending on my needs. But I think one thing that you do so beautifully in the book is bring them all together. Not all, because you can't, but you get us thinking that wisdom is wisdom. Now stop fixating on the source and thinking I need to be a one-strand thinker. And again, I think when you start talking about theists in particular, since that's my strand, I'm certainly a believer that wisdom is wisdom wherever the source, whatever the source is. That's the gift that we have. So I wasn't struggling at all when your source was Islamic or your source was Confucianism, etc. I just thought, what can I glean from this? And often I would stop and think, wow, that was a game-changing quote or story. We do tend, I think we're feeling it in the country as well, we tend to stay in a lane and say, I can't read that source of news, I can't turn on that channel, I'll somehow betray myself. It's almost a kind of quasi-religious fealty to a train of thought, a stream of thought. And I don't really want to get into the politics of it, but I do think your book challenges people to go, wisdom is wisdom. Look at a library rather than a book. The other thing I was thinking when you talked about this, call it sequence, is it's all true without question. It's also complicated and messy, because what I see in the people that I admire most, and you talk about that in the book, you talk about the people whom we admire. Why are we admiring them? What for? I think of one face keeps coming in front of me as you're speaking, and that's somebody who had a huge success in the material sense, built a business off the backpack in $20 basically, and sold it for in excess of, let's say, $100 million. So we could say, yeah, but it's lacking a certain sturdiness. It's lacking a certain self-transcendence, until you hear his story and get to know him deeply and realize what he did on a day-to-day personal interaction to interaction basis. And it wasn't just about building the kingdom, this mighty empire. It was affecting lives in a profound and beautiful way. Not consistently, as none of us are consistent. Maybe then he gets to a point where he says, okay, I've done that. Now I'm at a point where I can focus on moving beyond utilitarianism, let's call it that, in terms of goal setting and achieving a singular entity, a singular goal, an outcome. Now let me think about how I can be self-transcendent in the world, how I can be more generous. There is, as you might know, a Talmudic thought that says that the first half of our life should be in gathering in general terms, because we need to feed kids and educate them, etc. But the second half is giving out, is pouring forth from ourselves. And by the way, I see that in terms of people's philanthropy. And maybe, I wonder if there isn't some wisdom in saying, okay, there are stages. You'll get to that point if you choose that point. It's not all going to happen in your 20s.
Yeah. I think that the manner matters a lot. It's not, you can't necessarily look at the kind of, you say you're in gathering, right? And we'll use this image. There are different ways of in gathering. There are ways of ingathering that are already in anticipation turned outward towards the gift that will be given from that which is taken in. And there are ways of ingathering that are basically acquisitive.
Sure.
Right? So when we talk about self-transcendence, we're not necessarily talking about kind of egoism versus altruism, or kind of are you dedicating all of your life to service or philanthropy or whatnot at this time? But the question, is now the time of life where I ought to be doing that, is a self-transcendence question.
Sure.
Whereas the question, what do I want right now? What would I prefer? That's not, right? That's a question that's still indexed to your desires. Whereas the Talmudic thought that you referenced is indexed to a kind of considered vision of the shape of a human life with its stages. And so it has a sort of a broader horizon than anyone's particular wants.
Yeah, I hear you. Makes sense. Going back to particulars of the book, you talk about the fact that we can be more or less successful at being human. How do you unpack that big idea?
Oh, well, yeah, that's a claim that our students often struggle with, because it can be, we don't like the thought of sort of a holistic judgment that way. And it can be uncomfortable to imagine, well, certainly uncomfortable, and maybe it should be uncomfortable as to imagine judging other people's lives that way. But we try to suggest to them there could be something helpful in judging our own lives that way, which is to just to try to say, like, we're so used to judging success and failure in terms of particular endeavors. And, what does it mean to be a successful musician or a successful author, a successful teacher even? But there's some shared endeavor that we all are involved in that we think has even higher priority, or it's the framework in which all the rest of those things are meaningful, if to the extent to which they are, which is this sort of quest to like live lives worthy of our shared humanity. And I've grown more and more, we shift language even in the book between, talking about the good life or flourishing life or the life worth living. I'm drawn more and more to that way of phrasing it, right? Lives worthy of our shared humanity, right? Because it shows that when we talk about life worth living, we're not saying some lives are worth living and others aren't. We're not interested in the question of whether life is worth living, other than to say, yes, it is. All human lives are worth living. We're not interested in the good life can sound like the high life, right. Can sound like a life of wealth, sound like it involves yachts. The flourishing life has its own benefits, but this question of our shared living lives worthy of our shared humanity, there's some shared project here that we're trying to explore, and we can we can do better or worse at that, right? We can succeed and fail to degrees at that, right? In the language of Mencius, a Chinese philosopher, he says there are greater and lesser parts of the human. And you can invest your life in lesser parts or in greater parts, right? Greater parts are things that if you nourish them will eventually grow into virtues like humanity, humaneness, right? And compassion and wisdom. Or you can invest in the lesser parts, which are also part of what it is to be human, like being hungry and being hungry and wanting something to eat, being thirsty and wanting something to drink, being needing some comfort, needing some affirmation from some other people. These are all reasonable needs that we all need. But if you built a whole life around trying to get affirmation from other people, it's okay. You could build, you could build a life that way, but it wouldn't be leaning into from Mencius's point of view, it wouldn't be leaning into the best of what we are, the greater parts of what it means to be human. So that's what we mean by thinking the sort of succeeding or failing as a human. It's sort of saying, like, in what does the worthiness of our shared humanity exist? Like, where is it located, right? It is a worthy thing to live as a human being. But how do we lean into what is worthy in our shared humanity and lean away from the things that aren't, or put in their appropriate place things that are important, but only so much so, right? And at least when it comes to ourselves, do we have the courage to take a step back and ask the question, how are we doing at that? And how can we be doing better?
Yeah, I think it's in the epilogue or near the epilogue, I believe, when you talk about the notion that most of us aren't living an evil life. That guy or woman probably isn't reading to that point in the book, but who knows, hopefully. But you do say that we might be living a trivial life. And I think that's almost tragic, right? In terms of what does it mean to live a trivial life? And at what point in our lives do we read that sentence and ask ourselves that question? What's your thought on triviality without, it's too big for a 2-minute answer, but what's your thought that you want us to take away?
The first thing that I want to say is the axis of trivial and non-trivial is not the same as big and small, because there are any number of very big, splashy, hopelessly trivial lives out there. And there are countless invisible, small, ordinary, and utterly worthy, magnificent lives out there. And so we live in a world, in a media environment, in an economy that's going to try to say that significance and size, impact, scope are the same thing, and they're not. And so that means that our risk of living a trivial life actually comes in large part predominantly from internalizing that and seeking after a kind of empty, inflated scope. When the truth of the matter, when the worthiness of our shared humanity is going to be found elsewhere, probably somewhere a little quieter.
Yeah, beautifully said. I'm 100% with you. I want to ask the two of you. I'm assuming that a course, like any course, evolves and grows. And every time at the end of it, you say, there's something we need to insert or take away. And with a publisher and a published book with a fixed number of pages, you come to a point where you say, we're done, we can't do more. Yep. Was there anything essential left on the cutting room floor, so to speak, that you say needed to have been in the book? Or is there something that you feel like the book is evolving into?
So one thing we have realized to our chagrin, not just about the book, but I think about the project as a whole, is that we have put together a structure for asking these questions that actually makes it really, really difficult to advocate for the kinds of answers that we think are really the ones that we would advocate for. So we are both, full disclosure, as we disclose early in the book, we are both Christian theologians. And actually, for us as Christian theologians, for any number of other folks who reflect theologically, I would imagine the concept of grace is absolutely central. And I'm not totally sure where it shows up in the questions that we ask and the ways that we've structured the book. This sort of, we have this really big picture. Okay, there we can, and there we can. And in fact, we do talk about the idea of God, a God of love who creates out of love. And so we get a chance to talk there. But I routinely see students come, even through their encounters with Christianity and Judaism and Islam, and come out still thinking that they're all just about just striving and working as hard as you can. And at least for me as a Christian theologian, that feels like a misreading, at least of my own tradition, which, as I said, I think has everything to do with grace, and actually begins with the impossibility that we would ever strive our way to living a good life, and has everything to do with the thought that we instead would lean on God's grace and the wisdom and tradition of God's people to try to be formed, in our particular case, into the likeness of Jesus, not through any power of our own, but through the renewing work of God's Spirit. So but I don't know how to articulate that in the categories of the book that I wrote and encouraged folks to think in and through.
I think you did in the book. I
Okay,
didn't feel locked in, and I didn't feel like there wasn't this sense of space in that book. I think you offer. By the way, maybe that's one of the beauties of the book, that you're not hammering an answer. In fact, you're just saying, and what if, and perhaps. Sure. It's a book full of my favorite word, which is perhaps. That's my sense.
Mine too.
And I, as a rabbi and as a Jew and as a thinker on and a reader of religion, had myself constantly saying to myself, oh, interesting. I kind of wish you'd give me an answer. Wouldn't it be easy to get to page 30 or 300 and say, now I know? But I know better than that at this point in my life and in my study. I thought what you did so beautifully was say, and perhaps, and consider this maybe another subtitle to the book. And that, in a sense, I think is God's grace. And I'd say your grace as the generous teachers and authors that you are. Is there a follow-up to this? Does the course change as a result of the book?
So we're currently trying out teaching a course that's organized in the way that the book is. So the original course is organized not around the questions that form the chapters in that table of contents that you read, but around a series of it used to be organized around a series of traditions. Now we think of it in terms of a series of particular figures and the traditions that shaped them. And so we're trying it out, right? It's kind of the course spawned a book, which spawned a whole new course, and I think that's emblematic of the ways that, as much as we live in a world that's looking for really cut and dried formulas or recipes for fixing your life, reshaping it, getting it going in the right direction, however you want to talk about it. The process of discerning where those worthy lives are, of discerning the shape of life that would truly answer to the magnificent thing of being a human being, is a process is not going to stop. We're always going to be in conversation about it, and maybe kind of one of the intrinsic things about conversation is that it's meant to go on.
Yeah. Well, you've made a really beautiful, profound contribution to the conversation. And today, personally, I'm just honored to have both of you on this podcast and to reflect with you on a book just so well written. I'm certainly going to read it again. I'm going to find my memo notes, my bookmarks on my audio and go back to it and say, I need to now see that again. There were so many things that I couldn't, what's the word? There's a way to express it, but it's not coming to me right now. But bring into my life fully embrace, only because I needed to reread them, and I'll certainly do that. So Matt Croasmun, Ryan McAnnally-Linz, I'm just really grateful to both of you for a wonderful book, a wonderful course, and a great conversation this morning. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
It's been wonderful. Thank you.
Pleasure. I hope to see you at some point in person. I'm hoping you're going to open enrollment to people like me at some point that didn't get into Yale because of my math, my study of Seneca or anything else.
Back to the math grade.
Exactly. Amazing. You can have a good life. That's the end, the epilogue to the epilogue, even without good math.
Truly.
Thanks to both of you very, very much.
Thank you.
Our producer and editor is Jonah Lee Paz. Our musical theme is composed by Amotz Plessner, and our logo, graphic design by Janice Rudnunski. Find us wherever you find your podcasts.